Advocacy Event. My name is Sharon Hill, and I lead the work on sustainable urban development at UNEP. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this event today, where we will explore the findings and lessons learned from our latest research in partnership with the University of Pennsylvania on financing nature in cities, as well as the perspectives of global experts on what's needed to accelerate investments in urban nature. This session is taking place simultaneously and as a complement to a closed session at the World Economic Forum's annual meetings in Davos, where industry and finance leaders are discussing and devising strategies to increase and de-risk investments in nature-based solutions in cities to build more sustainable urban future. This Urban Shift session and the parallel session discussion at the WEF build on the momentum of the C40 Mayor Summit and at COP15, which led to a collective call from 15 mayors to increase financing of NBS in cities. Cristina Gomez Garcia Reyes, who is the lead for urban nature-based solutions at the WEF, may join us at the end of the session, depending on how her session goes, to report back from the parallel session that is taking place in Davos. So it's really exciting that we have leaders from all over the world discussing this topic as well. For those of you who don't already know, Urban Shift is an initiative funded by the Global Environment Facility and led by UNEP in partnership with WRI, C40, ICLEI, UNDP, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. Urban Shift focuses on transforming 23 cities in 9 countries through integrated urban planning approaches and building capacity to shift greener and healthier economies. I would also like to acknowledge today our collaboration with internal collaboration with our team working on the state of finance for nature, where we are building on the findings of the city's work. Today, we will kick off the discussion with a call to action from Mayor Luis Donaldo Colosio Rioja, the mayor of Monterrey in Mexico. He will speak in behalf of the 15 mayors that issued a call for financing at COP15 last month. My colleagues will post additional details in this chat. Following that, Professor Eugenie Birch, co-director at the Penn Institute for Urban Research, will present the key findings of the state of finance for nature in cities, time to assess. After, we will move to a very exciting panel to discuss opportunities to scale up investment for nature in cities. I will take the time to present these panelists later when introducing the discussion. Finally, Ingrid Coetzee, Director of Biodiversity, Nature and Health at ICLEI, will deliver the closing reflections, connecting our discussion with COP15. During the webinar, please post your questions for any of the speakers in the Zoom Q&A box. I hope you can see it. We will try our best to address them during the panel discussion or through chat. Now, I would like to invite the team to show the call for financing for nature from Mayor Rioja of Monterrey in Mexico.
Greetings. My name is Luis Donaldo Colosio Riojas, and I'm here as Mayor of Monterrey, capital of the state of Nuevo León and the second largest metropolitan area in Mexico. Our city faces new challenges every day, ever-growing pollution, a mobility crisis that steals from us close to 150 hours per year, and a considerable lack of green urban areas where we can best enjoy the city. Just recently, we faced one of our greatest challenges yet, a severe drought that forced us not only to rethink our lacking urban planning, but our entire relationship and responsibility with such a precious resource as is water. However, things are not as grim as they seem. For a new generation of sensible leaders and citizens are joining efforts, and we are adamant in not wasting time in facing these challenges head on. Accordingly, Monterrey was the first city in Mexico to declare a climate emergency. And from this action, a multilateral green agreement was called upon to unite all sectors of society in implementing a climate action plan for our city with distinct actions towards resilience, adaptability, mitigation, and restoration of our city's ecosystems. And at the heart of it all is the crown jewel of our green project portfolio, our urban parks and green corridor system, comprising of 94 hectares of parks and green spaces along 73 linear kilometers of green corridors, granting us a nature-based solution for improved air quality, sustainable mobility, and counteracting Monterrey's uncontrolled urban sprawl. These efforts will equal to a grand total of 10,000 new native young trees to our already bright industrious city and absorbing more than 500 tons of CO2, equivalent to 50 airplane flights from Monterrey to our country's capital. But none of this would be possible without the invaluable technical support, the invaluable financial support of a plethora of national and international organizations and institutions. Thus, the City of Monterrey is proud to join its fellow champion cities around the world in supporting the statement on financing nature for sustainable cities and regions. We call for the finance community, national, subnational governments, knowledge partners, and the private sector to increase their efforts in funding equally oriented nature-based solutions at the local level. The time for talk is over. We haven't a moment to lose. Nature is key in generating effective climate solutions for our cities and our people. We are ready to act, but we need the means to do so. Thank you immensely for your support. Greetings.
What an inspiring message. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your leadership and call for increased investment in nature at the local level. As the mayor said, the cities around the world are ready to take action to build sustainable and resilient futures, and they need the means to do so. We hope that the call from the mayors does not fall on deaf ears. I would like to move on now to a presentation on the findings of the state of finance for nature in cities. Time to assess. I invite Professor Birch, who needs no introduction, a rock star in the urban community, definitely, to join the virtual stage. Jeannie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. What an inspiring talk from the Mayor of Monterrey. And he underlines why cities are so important to this situation. As you all know, cities are 56% of the world population and produce 80% of the global GDP. And 70% of the known climate solutions are located within boundaries of subnational authorities. Next slide, please. Recently, this was recognized by the COP15 when they added Target 12 to the Global Biodiversity Framework adopted last December. And it, in strong words, acknowledged the importance of cities in mainstreaming conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Next slide, please. We have come a long way in terms of defining exactly what nature-based solutions are. Last March, at the UNEP Assembly, nations and member states accepted the definition that you see on the side of the slide, that nature-based solutions are actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use, and manage natural or modified terrestrial, coastal, and marine ecosystems, which address the social and economic environmental challenges effectively. But we have also to think about exactly what are urban nature-based solutions. As we know, cities are fast growing and time sensitive to the opportunities that are coming their way with regard to investments made in nature. And what are these investments? They include urban forests, parks, green transportation corridors, river and wetland restoration, sustainable drainage systems, and building such solutions as green roofs, urban farming efforts, and community gardens, and more. They are unique in this world of nature-based solutions. And we heard from the Mayor of Monterrey how local leaders are getting on the bandwagon and supporting urban nature-based solutions. However, the issue is that the idea of urban nature-based solutions and its co-benefits are less known to investors and decision makers at all levels of government and at all sectors of investment. It is time to invest now, and what can we do? The next slide, please. We know from the State of Nature Finance report in 2022 that the overall level of investment in nature is very high. The need for investment in nature is very high, some $11 trillion needed. But we know today that this is not happening. The financial flows are estimated to only be a half of what is needed per year and only a third what's needed by 2030. So it is time to act, to think about this, to think about particularly the urban nature-based solutions of this and how we can mainstream and accelerate them. The next slide, please. We have seen, for example, that the methodology for measuring nature-based solutions measures activities on land. These are forests and agriculture and so forth. But unfortunately, cities only act, unfortunately, from the point of view of nature-based solutions, but fortunately, from the point of view of environmental sustainability, cities occupy only 2% of the land. So they don't show up in the assessments that we see nature-based solutions in general. However, in a study that we did last year with UNEP, we have examples from 10 cities from the Americas, from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, from around the world that represent urban-based solutions and that are innovative in their approach. They focus on databases, on monitoring urban-based solutions, on plans, on various types of projects and how to finance them from the public and private point of view, on governance, thinking about subsidiarity, partnerships, and all of that. So we're going to have a brief trip through these examples so we can show you what some of our champion cities are doing. So in Quito, Ecuador, the water utility created the Quito Water Fund, established over 20 years ago, which is a trust fund that receives the revenues from water users and so forth, and then invests 2% of those revenues into the fund, and the fund then replaces or improves the watershed functions, the water supply, and the quality of the water itself. This has been a very successful model that's been replicated throughout Latin America and generated lots of interest around the world. In Buenos Aires, the city adopted its climate action plan. And what did it include? It included some very important things. For example, that it had a target on sustainable urban drainage systems in all local watersheds, as well as incorporated a building code to expand green roofs and walls, and called for a 20% increase in tree plantings, wetland conservation, and green corridor park projects and parks. To this, the World Bank has committed $200 million for the sustainable drainage system. And Jeff has also provided the city with more than $20 million to work with the green corridor system. Next slide, please. Let's travel now to Singapore. As an island nation, Singapore depends heavily on the coast, the health of its coast and marine environment. And it has established an interministerial coordinating committee to oversee the biodiversity and environment and monitor this through a database system called the BIOME. It has uses this then to create its extensive regulatory framework to support nature-based solutions, and has a master plan on the guides development and the climate action plan for various sectoral plans, including the Blue Plan, the Parks Plan, and the Water Bodies Plan. A very impressive level of activity in this area. And now let's go to Melbourne, Australia. Melbourne has a long history of responding to climate in the extreme due to the fact that they're subject to heavy rains, brush fires, drought, and so forth. They've developed a very broad greening approach over the past 20 years. Their Future of Melbourne study, issued in 2016, includes as a first priority maintaining the urban biosphere. In addition, they have a very, very active tree planting project, which is financed in a very original way. So their goals include urban forest, as well as green roofs, vertical gardens, and community garden investments. So they will increase the biodiversity, habitats, and ecosystem health dramatically. Next slide, please. London. London has many parks. They need to value them. And one way of doing that is using nature capital accounting in a way to determine what the assets are, the value of that asset is, particularly for the 31,000 acres of public green space. And they determined, using this method, it was worth more than 91 billion, an enormous sum, which the advocates of the park system were able to use successfully to provide more funding for its maintenance. And within nature capital accounting, things are taken into consideration, like the amenity value, physical and mental health, the value of environment, and avoided healthcare costs. This is a very important technique that can be adapted around the world. And let us go now to Sevilla in Spain, one of the hottest cities in Spain. Sevilla innovated this summer a project to name heat waves. This first weather warning system ties the forecast to health impacts. And they are then taking this warning system to think about how to improve the cooling in their situation. They're expanding the use of their underground aqueducts to use river water to cool air. They're building more squares, fountains, and landscape projects to reduce heat islands effects in particular neighborhoods. The European Union is financing this activity through its Life at Water Cool. Next slide, please. We come now to the Americas. In Miami, in the United States, the county level government is administering a tree fund trust for improving the canopy cover, as has been able to provide thousands of trees in priority areas in that city. And it also relies on private donations from such groups as ARUP, the American Forest Group, Wells Fargo, et cetera. So this shows a partnership between the public and private activities. And we heard about Monterrey, New Mexico, with its Green Corridor program, but quite interesting is the program that it has for linking development to public goods, particularly to the creation of nature-based solutions in exchange for rapid permissions. So developers can either donate land to the city to build public space projects or build projects within their own developments or support constructions of a park elsewhere in the city itself. Next slide, please. Now let us go to Africa. Quelimane in Mozambique, a coastal city that has one of the largest concentrations of mangroves on the east coast of Africa. It faces severe weather problems, and the rapid population growth has threatened this grove. So with support from USAID, they began to implement a community-based mangrove restoration project. Very complicated because the mangroves themselves provide, the use of the mangrove material provides shelter materials for housing. So part of the project is an educational project to show the necessity of supplying and preserving these mangroves while finding other ways to help informal settlers in particular find shelter and livelihood. In Freetown, Sierra Leone, a $1 million tree planting plan is well active. This is part of a larger grant from Jeff called the Resilient Urban Sierra Leone Project, which deals with drainage as well as capacity building and the tree planting. And in a unique sort of project, the city recently labeled 5,000 trees as and issued tree impact tokens that were available for sale to organizations to create a tree trading market to finance additional planting. This is worth watching. Next slide, please. So here we have seen these 10 cities. There are many more cities who are engaged in these sorts of things. And we know, however, that simply there's not enough money going into these projects that needs to support them. And we would hope that cities, for their championship, will be able to find ways to support the kinds of projects that are needed. There's also a data gap. There's no database that tells us exactly what is happening in cities. So this is something that we need to be considering in terms of future activities to create this sort of database to understand what's happening in cities, to understand the fact that many nature-based solutions are basically nested in larger infrastructure projects, as we described in some of the earlier examples that I gave you. And we need to understand how they are parts of mega eco projects across political jurisdictions, now being studied by a very bright PhD student at Penn. And lastly, there's a capacity gap. We need to find ways to help all sectors, public, private, non-governmental authorities, to understand the means and the needs the financial tools and the public advocacy to support urban nature-based solutions, which is so important to the future of our nations, our cities, and the world. The next slide, please. So how are we going to address these gaps? Well, first of all, you've heard our first project, the champions of mayors and city officials. We had a brilliant and very exciting talk by the mayor of Monterey, and many other mayors have also supported this. We need to align and highlight local governments with national and global climate goals. This is what we mean when we talk about partnerships and we talk about subsidiarity. And of course, we need to implement the newly adapted Target 12 in the Global Diversity Framework. Lastly, we need to develop metrics to track progress over time, not only to track progress, but also to understand the needs of what we need to do in this area. We need to monitor baseline conditions and then monitor further the nature of the investments going forward. And we know that there are many investment-ready urban nature-based solutions at the local level. We need to create a way to identify them and get those the funding to them as quickly as we can in order to harness the power of cities for nature and to succeed in protecting our climate in the most important ways. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation. A larger study with the details will be forthcoming, and you can contact us, the authors, or the UNEP people, particularly Sharon Gill, who is head of the cities unit of the UNEP program. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeannie, for your presentation. It's been wonderful collaborating with your team on this topic. So it's been a lot of fun. Serious research, but a lot of fun.
And many discoveries.
Yes, and many discoveries indeed. What Jeannie presented is a preview of the summary for local policymakers of the State of Finance for Nature report, and it will be posted later this month at the website. My colleagues may have already shared over chat, and will highlight again. Let me now move on to the panel discussion, and let me start by introducing the speakers. For the audience, please feel free to post your questions for Jeannie and the panelists in the chat. If we don't have time for a live exchange, we will reply during and even after the event in written form. We are very honored to have a distinguished panel of experts on finance and nature here in this virtual room. For some reason, my Zoom has given up on me and I cannot see our panelists. There you go. Very nice to see everyone. We will be hearing today from Craig Hansen, Managing Director, Technology, Managing Director and Executive Vice President for Programs of the World Resources Institute. Hi, Craig. Mauricio Rodas, former mayor of Quito, Ecuador, and visiting scholar of the Penn Institute for Urban Research. Mauricio, are you there?
I'm here.
Great, good to see you. And we also have Barbara Barros, Senior Manager, Adaptation Finance of C40 Cities. Barbara, nice to have you here. And Caroline Wexler, Director at Pollination Group, a specialist climate change investment and advisory firm. Very nice to meet you and to see you here, Caroline. We met a few days ago already. So thank you, Craig, Mauricio, Barbara, and Caroline for being here. I will ask each one of you 2 questions, and you will have around 3 minutes to respond to each. So we start with you, Craig. Exciting stuff happening at WRI at the moment, at the Biodiversity COP15 in Montreal. WRI and the GEF joined hands to launch the permanent secretariat of the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. It would be great to hear more from you about the objective of the coalition and how it will support the subnational actors in achieving Target 12.
Great. Thank you very much, Sharon, and welcome everyone. It's an honor to be here at this event. Super important, everything that we're talking about here. So yes, in December in Montreal, China and Canada co-hosted the 15th Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity. At the last minute, major international agreement was made, basically setting the agenda, the biodiversity agenda for this decade here. One of the agreements was the so-called 30 by 30, the goal to get under some form of protection, 30% of the world's landmass and waterways, including the ocean, by the year 2030. It's 30% by 2030. The World Resources Institute and the GEF made an announcement just after that we've been selected and are joining hands to become a permanent secretariat for a group of countries numbering right now 116 that even before the CBD made its agreement, they had already committed to protecting 30%, the global goal of 30% protection by the year 2030. These 116 nations include some of the largest nations on the planet, and I'm sure that the number will grow given that the CBD now has formally approved that target. What we're doing is you now have country demand for bumping up the areas of protection up to 30%. Those countries need technical assistance and financial assistance. And so what we're doing as the Joint Secretariat is helping to connect that country demand with the supply of that technical assistance and financial assistance to get there with a goal of achieving that 30% target by the year 2030. It's a landmark deal. It's a landmark ambition by nations of the planet, and the world needs it. The science says we need it, and citizens are saying that we need it. I think there's a fantastic role for the folks here in this meeting right now who are very interested in the urban and the subnational arenas. Urban areas, subnational areas have to play a role in helping these nations actually achieve the target. Urban areas are where the voters are. Urban areas are where the money is, etc. Urban areas depend upon the protection of natural ecosystems for their well-being. And so I think there's a lot of work that can be done by cities and subnational governments actually flexing their muscles and supporting national governments to actually help those nations achieve that 30%. And I'm sure cities and those active in cities can play a big role in providing some of that technical assistance and financial assistance to helping nations get there.
Thank you very much, Craig. And we look forward to learning more and collaborating with you on the coalition in this very important topic. Let me turn over to you, Mauricio. And you have been a passionate speaker on the access to finance, given your experiences as a mayor. And you've been a key champion in this work. Around key barriers that are preventing cities from realizing their ambitions. What can be, in your mind, new approaches to help cities access finance for nature?
Thank you so much, Sharon. This is a great conversation, and I'm thrilled to be part of it. We have to start by realizing that we are confronting an international financial system that was designed for countries, not for cities. That's the main problem here. And we need to make it more cities friendly if we want to support cities to tackle climate change in an effective way. Because in order for cities to do so, they need a significant amount of resources that they just simply don't have access to at this point. What's the reality we're facing? In 56% of the countries of the world, cities are banned from international borrowing. In the countries where cities are allowed to do so, in most cases, they need a national government guarantee to access to international financing. A national government guarantee that may not be granted because of political rivalries between the national and the local government. On top of that, cities in many cases lack the capacity or the level of credit worthiness to access finance. According to the World Bank, less than 5% out of the 500 largest cities in the developing world have international credit ratings, and less than 20% of them have local credit ratings. So they are simply not credit worthy. And we're talking here about the largest 500 cities in the developing world. If we think about the reality of the medium and small size cities, the situation most likely is much worse. So that's the kind of challenges we are facing here. We need to reform the international financial system to provide the kind of resources cities need to undertake the infrastructure transformation needed to tackle climate change in an effective way. Now, in order for that to happen, different ideas have been floating around. And I think that we have to be bold and disruptive. And one of the ideas that I like the most is one that was promoted in a report that was released in 2019, published by C40, ODI, the Climate Works Foundation, and Baker McKenzie, about the idea of setting up a green cities development bank. And this is a idea that may be regular scenario for many, but I think it's the kind of initiative that should be explored deeply, because it can become really a game changer in terms of becoming an institution that could provide direct financial facilities for cities, that could become also a guarantees fund for cities, that could be providing technical assistance in a broad way to improve cities' capabilities to develop bankable projects and to improve their level of financial stability and credit worthiness. This bank could combine the best features of green banks with those of development banks, to become a financial institution specialized in cities, and therefore with the ability of coming up with a robust pipeline of projects that could be attractive, for example, for the private sector to invest in cities. So these are the kind of initiatives I think that should be discussed further. And good news is that this idea is taking off once again now. There's an important number of experts and organizations around the world coming up with mechanisms to further explore different ways for this project to become a reality. And this is just an example of the things that can be done. But again, my point is we need to be bold, we need to be disruptive. And one of the things that we should take into account is how these discussions should be geared not only about how to improve the financial landscape for cities, but very importantly also how can we shift the current imbalance there is when we compare the finance available for mitigation versus adaptation related projects. So this is the kind of aspects that we should also be taken into consideration when we come up with different ways to improve the financial landscape for cities in order to provide them with the necessary resources to become drivers in the battle against climate change. Thank you.
Very passionate argument, Mauricio, and I can imagine that there's a coffee that needs to happen between you and Craig in the discussion of the coalition as well. I think these disruptive ideas that are quite innovative really need a little bit more of our collaboration in this virtual room for us to work together. So it's an exciting new initiative, and we really do look forward to working with you in the next steps. I could see you nodding, Barbara. I can see that this idea isn't new to you. You were probably part of putting together the paper. So let me now turn to you. Cities around the world are increasingly recognizing the role of nature in building resilience to environmental risk and delivering sustainable development outcomes for all. Could you please share with us some of the best practices from C40 cities that are investing and implementing NBS as climate solutions? What are the challenges for these cities in meeting their goals, and more importantly, bringing all of these ideas to scale? We all want to innovate, and we see champions all over the world. How can we bring it over the edge and really into a more global movement? Over to you.
Thank you. And I feel very lucky because now I feel that I just need to connect in the dots, because most what I would like to talk, like I listed a lot from Eugene and also Mauricio when presented. So very lucky. So I think most of the barriers, and I just like to connect barriers with some solutions from for cities, because I think that this kind of connects how cities are overcoming barriers, and most of them, they're very common. So starting what Marisha mentioned, that I feel that is the most of the barriers for particularly emerging cities. So for example, cities struggle with creditworthiness, as Marisha mentioned, like national dependency that always make difficult for cities, particularly when they have political hurdles, or also when have the time for accessing grants and external grants. So this also makes it difficult for cities to advance climate action implementation, particularly nature, and also focus on, and also hinder the capacity of the city to hinder the autonomy of the city to implement projects. And in that way, I think I like to coming back, for example, that Eugene presented first, that is Free Country Town campaign, because I think that is a really good example, because the city developed with the support of World Bank, Bloomberg, philanthropists, support a finance model that can support the cities to overcome the issues of autonomy. Because the city developed a finance model that, as presented by Eugene, each tree is planted, tracked, and also develop impact token that can be traded and so on, and kind of work as a crypto money. But the point is, they created a finance model that they can raise revenue for implementing the target of 1 million trees and by their own resource. They don't need to go through national governments and so on. So that's a thing I know that the solutions I'd like to bring, because I feel that this is the most of the comments that we receive from our C4 cities that struggle with the same thing. And also coming back also with the presentation of Eugene, I have another case that is still on this stage, but I think that is kind of innovative and can support us to think on how to move forward our issue, for example, to know how cities invest in nature. Most of the cities, they doesn't know how much they're investing. They doesn't know if like it's too little, too much. They don't know because they're not reporting also. So in that way, I like to give an example of the city of Montreal that is now, they have a goal for allocate at least 10% of the 10-year capital budget to projects that increase resilience in nature. And how to do that, they develop a methodology to assess exactly what is the project that can better improve resilience for infrastructures, also green infrastructures, but also how it can get the best of investments, how the investment can bring better cost benefits. And to do that, I think that is important to mention, they are working in a mainstream way with different departments, not the only one that develop the projects, but also with the budget departments, with the operation departments, and also maintenance, in order to understand how this methodology can work. And to do that, they're really working training, capacity building, and to develop baseline to understand how to increase investment. I know that I'm taking a lot of my time, so I'm happy to contribute later. So thank you so much, Irene and colleagues, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Barbara. I think we need an entire session for you to share all of the wonderful examples from C40 cities. Caroline, you have the important task of speaking for the entire private sector. No, I'm just kidding. So the private sector has a key role to play, obviously, in scale up. And Barbara has already given us a few good examples of cities that are trying to do this. Can you tell us some of the key barriers in private investment, and in what solutions your team may have found that exist to help cities increase private sector finance in local NBS? Like, what are the structural things?
Thanks, Sharon. And I will try to speak on behalf of the whole private sector. Thanks also so much for having me, and congrats to all the teams that worked on the State of Finance for Nature report. It's a really fantastic resource, and I'm excited to see the city's appendix come out soon. So yeah, as you said, the private sector obviously has a huge role to play in financing nature generally and in cities. And that was one of the big takeaways for me from the State of Finance for Nature report, is the limited role that the private sector is currently playing in financing nature-based solutions, particularly when you compare it to climate change, where private finance is now playing a much larger role than public finance. And I think to some degree that reflects that climate is higher up on the agenda than biodiversity and nature currently are, but also some of the current commercial realities of financing nature. And that actually makes me really optimistic because there's a big opportunity to bring in more private finance in the same way that's being done for climate by developing the market and policy infrastructure to make nature-based solutions more commercially attractive. In cities where some of the more obvious commercial pathways for nature, like sustainable agriculture or forest production, aren't always viable. And many of the main benefits of urban nature-based solutions that have already been highlighted by Eugenie and others, like local health benefits and climate resilience, are more on the cost reducing side than on the revenue generating side. To Mauricio's point about being disruptive and creative, we really need to think of new ways to enable those commercial opportunities for nature-based solutions in cities. And so I won't repeat what everyone's been saying. There's obviously a huge number of areas we need to be pushing to unlock private finance. And they're really nicely articulated in the State of Finance for Nature report as well. So I'll just briefly highlight 3 areas that I would see as priorities for cities. Firstly, finding ways for us to reduce path dependency on gray infrastructure. There are quite a few really wonderful studies that show that in many cases, nature-based infrastructure can be cost efficient relative to gray infrastructure and generate additional co-benefits in cities, but there's a more limited track record and evidence base on green infrastructure, and implementation can also require specialist expertise. So the private sector may lack the incentives and the capacity to invest in infrastructure that might be perceived as higher risk. So I think there's a role for the public sector to develop policies and economic incentives, as well as finding ways to support knowledge development and sharing that enable this shift in the private sector. And I think some of the work that's ongoing in the UK is a great example of ongoing efforts. DEFRA put out the findings of a review, I think either this week or last week, recommending that SUDs are mandatory in new developments. And they worked with developers in particular to understand what some of the barriers to uptake might be and support needs for implementation. I see we're running out of time, so I'll just go through really briefly the other 2 areas. The second area I would highlight is developing projects that tap into emerging nature markets, including voluntary carbon markets, which we know are growing in price and in volume, and natural climate solutions now dominate that market. So there could be opportunities in cities to attract investors through generating carbon credits. Eugenie had a great example of tree impact trading tokens, and emerging biodiversity credit markets could also be great opportunities for cities. That was highlighted at COP15, that there's increasing demand for these types of markets, and that could be an important way to make nature-based solutions more investable. And finally, I'd highlight the importance of developing robust and systematic methodologies for quantifying the benefits of nature-based solutions, which is also highlighted as a priority area in the State of Finance for Nature report. And this is particularly important, I think, for urban nature-based solutions, which generate a lot of adaptation and resilience benefits for reducing flood risk, reducing the urban heat island effect, et cetera. And this could help crowd in local private finance as well, if it's well articulated and well quantified for private sector actors like insurers, real estate, private utilities, et cetera, who would directly benefit from the cost savings of these risk reductions.
Thanks, Caroline. I think it's very interesting, the points that you raised, the 3 points that you raised. I took note of it, and especially you also looked at the multi-level governance, because this groundbreaking direction from DEFRA on sustainable urban drainage systems would then give private sector partners the push to really look at SUDs as a solution. So thank you very much. Let me finish the discussion with one last question to all of the speakers. And Jeannie, please feel free to jump in. Kindly turn on your camera. So we heard today, this is a really broad question. We heard today that attracting urban nature investments is challenging, but there is an opportunity to make the case for increased action in cities. What do you think can be done if there's one thing? I know there's a lot to better track financial flows to nature at local level, and it would be just great to hear your thoughts on if we need to focus on one thing, what would it be? And let me start with, based on the people that I see on the screen. So I'll start with you, Barbara. What do you think?
Oh, this is very difficult, Sharon. But, very difficult, and I'm not good for prioritization. But at least I would say that as we learned with the presentation of Eugene, it's really important to develop reporting systems that cities start to understand how much investment they are going to towards nature in their cities. And that's really important to develop common standard metrics and a baseline for that. So sorry, I did 3, but but I hope that worked.
No worries. This is we're putting you in a brainstorming session all of a sudden. So just following my screen again, I have Craig next on my screen. So over to you, Craig.
Yeah, great. No, it's a good question. It was brought up in the main keynote that Eugenie had here. I mean, being simplistic is almost, you need a tag, right? You know, when someone's making investments, they need almost like that extra tag, that field that says this is also for nature, right? When people are classifying. I know it sounds easy and simple. It's probably really hard to do. There's reasons why it's not being done, but that simple tagging and underneath of that is probably somebody needs to make the case for that tag, right? I mean, we all know it here, but I think we just cannot give up on making the case that nature is important for cities. Not only is it a climate solution, it's also for better health. There's a lot of research coming out about how nature in and around urban areas is better for human health. It's also important for water, right? You look at the news, the water crises that various cities, having nature in and around, urban areas actually really helps in terms of ensuring water security. I mean, our report we've done, Better Forests, Better Cities, kind of lays all this out. And I just think we got to keep on plugging that message.
Thanks, Craig. Very clear and inspiring. I move on to Mauricio, who's next on my screen.
Thank you. Well, I think that in order to foster a better measurement or data generation on nature investments in cities, we need to also measure the benefits from doing that, right? And in that regard, I think, and I want to go back to Jeannie's point about natural capital accounting in cities. I think it has a great potential because it can generate clear information about the benefits coming from ecosystem services for things like what Craig just mentioned, right? Human health, quality of life, natural resources, so on and so forth. So as much as we can show the benefits from investing in nature, it will be much easier to generate that data about that.
You're talking about NCA, so I'll put Caroline next because I know this is a passion project of hers. So Caroline.
Yeah, Mauricio, you stole my response. No, completely agree. And I think it's really important to collect this data alongside developing natural capital accounting frameworks because we need to understand, how much is being invested in and what the gaps are in investment to maintain the current levels of ecosystem services that are being achieved in cities. And also to kind of build on, Mauricio, your other point around developing an evidence base, I think it would help with building out the pipeline of potential commercial opportunities if we had more of an evidence base around the success stories of commercial opportunities and nature-based solutions.
Thanks, Caroline. And Jeannie.
Okay, last but not least.
Exactly.
Anyway, here's my single idea, is to build on what we've just heard from the panelists to develop a conceptual framework for developing a database and then implement that database.
Very concise, but very difficult to do.
But we have lots of helpers around the world.
So we're going to rope everybody in this panel in this work.
Well, if we don't start somewhere, we won't be there.
Yeah.
And to Craig's point, cities do not exist without water.
Exactly. I think there's a lot of discussion around that happening in-house as well. Thank you. I want to spend more time discussing with everybody in this virtual panel. I want to check if we have a few questions in the audience. We have 3 minutes, so I will use the time to get a question from the audience. One sec. Okay. We have a question for, sorry, they have all been mostly addressed actually by our very competent support team answering questions. Is there,
Sharon, there is a question for Caroline, if you can see it. Would you like me to read it? Or?
Yes, please, if you don't mind.
Oh no, it's actually a follow-up question that would be more adequate in writing about the studies and report that you mentioned earlier, and that sounded very interesting.
Okay, so well, let me end this panel discussion by saying thank you very much. Dear panelists, we will definitely be in touch with you after this discussion again. And for many of you, we already work with your organizations, but we will definitely deepen this conversation with you on this particular topic. I will now invite Ingrid for closing reflections on the outcomes of COP15. Ingrid was running around at COP15 herding cats. I'm one of the people that she was herding at COP15, and it's very good to see you back and rested from vacation, Ingrid. So please, could you please share with us some of your closing reflections on the outcomes of COP15 and the new Global Biodiversity Framework, what it means for local governments? Ingrid, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And it was really great listening to all these amazing speakers and panelists, because so much of what they are saying resonates with what came out of COP15. So I think that for me, there were three major things that came from COP15. One is obviously the new policy framework, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And in that, there's a couple of important principles, the one around whole of government. And part of the whole of government was that for the first time, it recognizes that cities and other levels of subnational governments, although they're not parties to the convention, they are certainly organs of state and completely integral and in fact quite crucial to the implementation of the new framework and to achievement of many of the targets, not just the obvious target 12, which speaks specifically to the urban sort of environment, but several of the others. And I think it's great that Craig started off with the reference to the 30 by 30 targets, because I think that this is also one of the targets where cities can play a huge role. We know that in many parts of the world, cities do not have a mandate for protected areas or for ecosystem restoration. But in many other cities, this is done. I live in the city of Cape Town, which is completely surrounded by different types of protected areas. Many of them are of a national level, but also of urban level. They are managed by the city administration. So clearly there is an important role to play for cities there too. I think if we look at some of the other targets, we talked about target 12, which is the obvious one, but there's also targets around consumption and patterns, and there's targets around pollution. And those are all things where cities have a role to play. They might have specific mandates, etc. So certainly the one thing that I sort of took as a takeout message from the COP is that there is so much spectrum for cities to really come to their own now and to make a contribution. And there's a real expectation from the parties. And in fact, many of the sort of passage discussions was around, you know, we look to cities. We're already seeing there's a lot of innovation and amazing work, and some of the best practices were mentioned here today. They also came out at the summit, the 7th summit that we held as a parallel event to the COP. And so I think that, you know, the time is here, and linked to that is the real need to scale out and to get more investment. And it was great to hear that there are some really innovative ways in which we can increase the funding envelope and increase investment from natural capital accounts, to the way in which we budget, the point about investing in nature-based solutions. For me, it's always surprising to think that there's so many obvious benefits about nature-based solutions. There is still a very strong hesitancy that we see across cities all over the world, and big cities as well as small cities, to apply nature-based solutions. And I think it is certainly about building that case for greater investment in nature, whether it's through nature-based solutions or whether it's through ecosystem restoration. And on the topic of ecosystem restoration, the point that I want to make, and I think it also came out very clearly from COP, is the need to restore our ecosystems. And this is very much part of that whole package. If we look at the 30 by 30 targets, and we're in this decade of ecosystem restoration, and I think this decade can be a very valuable vehicle, as it were, where cities can really profile their work and spread the word and share their best practices. The other thing besides the sort of policy framework is the need for action. We have less than 7 years left before the 2030 targets have to be achieved. And cities are certainly going to be important role players in that. And linked to that is the point that we talked about today about funding. The call for finance and increased financing in nature for sustainable cities, which came from the C40 summit, was also announced at a special event at the 7th summit. And I think it's really great to see how there's a growing awareness and growing calls for greater investment at the city level, and also the expectation that the national governments must create the enabling environment, and with private sector. And I think that this is one of those things that it's not just going to be up to government, but it's certainly also open for greater investment through the private sector. And at the community level, in South Africa, for example, we have a very strong stewardship model where you use landowners and even communities, smaller communities and sort of indigenous communities, and spread that responsibility around protection and looking after one's nature as you know, as a wider responsibility. So it's not just something that government should do, but certainly the whole of society should get involved in as well. I think the other thing for me that was really important is what came out of the COP as well, is that there is for the second time, a dedicated decision around engaging cities and subnational governments to ensure the enhancement of the global biodiversity framework. But what's different this time is the level of ambition. And very clearly in this dedicated decision, there is a plan of action which speaks to things like capacity building, science and knowledge transfer. It speaks to very specifically resource mobilization as well. And it speaks to the important point about reporting. We know that there's a lot of great work that's being done at cities. There were some great examples given here this afternoon, but it's generally not properly recorded, and it doesn't get escalated up into the country reports. So a lot of the good work is not measured and it's not taken into account. And I think when we talked about, and I found the discussion around building the case very interesting, we need to have these examples. We need to have this evidence to strengthen the case for nature-based solutions becoming the new paradigm as opposed to the sort of exception, but also for greater investment, whether this is investment through the sort of traditional development finance institutions, or whether it is through corporate projects and development, building that case and showing what can be done and how it improves not just the quality of life and human health, but also improves the sort of resilience of cities and the livability of cities and the local economies and local economic development. So I think the final thing, besides the two that I talked about, the policy framework and the funding and the need for action, the third thing for me that stood out is the need for more partnerships and how important partnerships are. And these are partnerships between cities, but also partnerships between cities and their stakeholders, whether this is the agriculture sector, or it's the forestry or the mining sector, or the community, or other levels of government. And one of the things that I just want to mention here is that within this ambit of partnerships, there are so many programs and initiatives and networks around, and we really need to start working together. And I mean, Craig, when he talked about the coalition, the High Level Ambition Coalition, and Mauricio, with your very impassioned plea for really redesigning and having this disruptor approach to finance, it made me think about one of the partnership initiatives which UNEP is involved in, and now also WHO and WWF, IUCN, ICLEI, and it's called Cities with Nature. And this is a partnership amongst all of these global organizations, which brings cities from all over the world together. These are small cities. Many of them are the sort of C40 type cities like Montreal, Melbourne, but they're also the smaller intermediary cities. There's some really tiny little cities. And it's really interesting to see how common problems around whether it's pollution or health or finance or infrastructure development are dealt with in different ways. And if we can harness these partnerships and spend and work together in terms of building the case and coming up with new innovative ways in which to fund projects and to increase investment, I think we do stand a chance to meet our 2030 targets. And the fact that cities will be a huge contributor to meeting those targets. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. And I would just like to acknowledge your incredible leadership in bringing together the urban actors at COP15. Such great work. Thank you so much. Before we end this session, I'd like to ask all of the speakers to kindly turn your cameras on for a picture, for an online picture. I hope everybody's still online. Margot, let me know if we're good.
I think we're good.
Good, thank you. So on behalf of Urban Shift, many of you are part of that team, WRI, C40, ICLEI, the University of Pennsylvania, and UNEP State of Finance for Nature team, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. We look forward to working with you all to help cities make peace with nature. Thank you very much for joining this session, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone. Bye.